I will only tell you this, right, as far as it goes, that my passion of fishing cost me a lot, emotionally and financially.
Yeah.
Because, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like, well, yeah, it's like, when you get back home late at night and the wife's indoors, say, what time to call this? Dinner been ready 3 hours. So, yes, dear, but the fish was rising,
Yep.
They don't understand. You're not going to leave the river
No.
when the fish are rising. You know what I'm saying?
That was Davy Wotton talking about what he would tell his 25-year-old self if he could go back in time and give some words of advice to young Davy. This is episode number 35 of the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. In today's episode, I interview Davy Wotton, one of the great wet fly fishermen and the person who breaks down the steps to catching big trout on one of the oldest fly fishing methods in the book. We talk about the 6 flies he has used that have caught him fish all around the world, cover the Davy knot, why the angle of the hang is critical, and why wet fly fishing is not all about the wet fly swing. Don't miss this as Davy brings us back to the UK and a dubbing company he founded and eventually sold to Wopsy, and that line of dubbing is still available today. So, without further ado, here's Davy Wotton from DavyWottonFlyFishing.com. How's it going, Davy?
Pretty good right now.
Yeah. All right. I connected with a few people. I mean, I heard your name around, and I've been kind of doing a lot of research and kind of reading up and watching some of your videos and stuff. And I've been pretty impressed with the sort of the information you have out there. And today I was hoping to jump into a lot of information kind of on wet fly fishing and maybe your background, as related to that. But maybe you can start us off first, talk about how you first got into fly fishing, and then how you got into guiding, because I know you're still guiding, and it sounds like you've been guiding for a number of years. Maybe you can tell us how that all came to be.
Yeah, okay. Well, real briefly, fish and water have always been something I was attracted to since I was a little kid, And one of my family members that actually owned a farm that a trout stream ran through it. And that was really my first introduction to fly fishing, so far as there used to be a person, and his name I forget right now, that would come there and fly fish. Now, it's back in the 1950s. And that just kind of fascinated me, because I'd fished and caught fish by other means at the time. And that was the first thing that intrigued me, just the physical act of watching that fly line going through the air, and that guy fishing the way that he did. And so to answer your question, that was the first thing that instilled in me the interest to fly fish. I guess to a large extent, a lot of that's history, but nevertheless, he was the person that first gave me a rod to use, which was actually an old bamboo hardy rod, would you believe, at the time. And that gave me the opportunity to get to learn and develop some skills. But, unlike today where you've got fly shops all over the country and this, that, and other, where I was living in the UK at the time, there's no such thing. There'd be fishing tackle stores, and they may sell a few flies, but primarily most of their market was related to other methods of angling, essentially what they call in UK coarse fishing, which is, non-salmonid species. And if you live near the coast, it would be saltwater fishing, for Atlantic cod and stuff like that. Anyway, moving on some, when I was in school, one of the games masters was a Scottish person, and he knew I had a serious interest in fishing, and he did too. Not so much fly fishing, but he would take me at times to places, lakes, we'd fish for freshwater species of fish. But he also gave me some equipment, including fly tying products, that his father used to own. And that's what got me interested in tying flies, which was probably around the age of around 12 years old. And within that collection, there was a book by W.C. Stewart, which, of course, is a renowned Scottish fly fisherman of that era. And that got me going on it. Well, I always had a material interest in wildlife, animals, birds, whatever. And of course, as we all know, fly tying has got a lot of relationship to wildlife because we use the byproducts of them.
Right.
So that was what got me going so far as the interest in tying flies. And in fact, by about 1966, 67, somewhere in that era, I was that good at doing it that I was able to sell flies to a local fishing tackle shop. And that moved on from that. I started my own mail order business, would you believe, selling flies. And that moved on later to me selling fly tying material. That moved on later to me developing different products for fly fishing. Probably the best known was the SLF range of dubbing material, which was sold in the world market. And I started developing those products in about the mid-'80s. And the reason I did was because the standard dubbing material generally used for flies in Scotland, England, Ireland, and Wales was silver. And there's no argument about it that it has intrinsic values that no other natural fur has got, primarily because it's translucency, more than anything else. It's not the easiest material in the world to work with, that I will tell you. However, they've become a ban on it, and largely related to the fact that the public didn't like the manner in which baby seals were culled, shall we say.
Right.
And so, at the time, the importation of seal fur was banned into the UK, and there was really no alternative. And my mind got to thinking about that, And to cut a long story short, I got to know a guy who was a chemist that worked at a company, ICI, which is Imperial Chemical Industries, in the UK, which similarly made products like DuPont, and essentially extruded filaments, or synthetic filaments, shall we say, which could be nylon, polypropylenes, da-da-da. And that gave me, if you like, the foresight to be able to work with different synthetic materials and make combinations of blends, which included, in some cases, both natural material and synthetic material, to produce those ranges of dubbins, which exceeded over 300 at the time. And, of course, I made a lot of signature series dubbins as well, the Paul Jorgensen series, Dave Whitlock series, and a good few more. But eventually, I think about like 30 years after dealing just also with the material side of the business, as well as, rods, reels, lines, and everything else that went with it, I kind of decided, to be honest about it, I'm getting kind of burned out with that. And there was only two companies in the world that had really the resources to, if you like, take over the SLF dubbing business, because there's a lot more to that than people realize. It's just not a question of, mixing materials into a coffee grind. You're dealing with volume, kilos at a time, and all of the processes required. And as far as natural materials is concerned, for example, you buy 100,000 hairs mask in, well, you got to get hair off them, if you understand what I'm saying, and stuff like that. Excuse me. So, anyway, of the two companies in the country that had the want and also the ability to continue manufacturing the products, Wapsi was the one that eventually I sold that business to. And that was probably 15 years ago, I guess, or maybe a little more than that. And they still produce them here in Mountain Home, Arkansas. So that side of it as well. As far as teaching and guiding, I started doing that. Well, what I did, I became the first NACI, which is National Anglers Council instructor, in game angling, which is what they define salmon and trout fishing in the UK, call it game angling, in, I believe it was 1974, something like that. And then there were other standards of qualifications, APJI, Association of Professional Game Angling Instructors, trout and salmon, da-da-da. Well, I did all those too. And so I started guiding, for one of a better word. Of course, a guide in the UK or Europe, whatever, it's generally called a ghillie. It's the same thing. In the 70s, on local rivers and reservoirs. The interesting thing about that, I guess, and unless people have been over there, they wouldn't understand that, is that, the English chalk streams are always considered to be the hallowed place of trout fishing. Well, I will argue that to some extent, what we have to consider is that those persons who had the notoriety in society at the time were wealthy individuals, and they were able to fish rivers like the Tessietch and whatever. They were also largely the people that wrote about fly fishing. And of course, a lot of history as we know it, whether it be Halford, Skews, or whatever, is related to the English chalk streams, with probably the exception of a few of the publications that were written on the North Country style of fishing, which is up in Yorkshire, with spiders and soft hackles and stuff like that. But you know what? In truth, that represents such a small percent of what took place on trout water systems, whether they were rivers, natural streams, lochs, whatever, between England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And so, in many respects, a lot of the history, if that's the way to explain that with you, never really got written about in that sense of the word. And when I actually started tying flies commercially, most of the flies that I had to tie were established known patterns of persons like Halford, Skews, this, that, and the other. Because in many cases, a lot of the flies which we now more the public are more aware of, shall we say, weren't kind of looked at like that. Interestingly enough, I will tell you that 80% of the fly pans that I produced commercially back there in the late 60s, 70s, and up into the 80s were essentially wet flies, not dry flies. And another interesting thing about that is that the majority of fly fishermen between England, Ireland, Wales, and Scotland fish natural lochs or man-made reservoir systems or privately owned waterways that are stocked with trout, because access to rivers is not like it is here. They're right parent ownership. So you either belong to a syndicate, a member of a club or association, or whatever the case may be, that lease sections of water. Excuse me, saying. So in many cases, it eliminates general public access. And therefore, for people to fly fish, or at least catch trout, shall we say, yeah, they would have to go to other systems other than rivers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so, wow, that is a definitely a full history, and that's not even, that's kind of just the start of your connection with back to the UK and that area. But how did you bring it up from there into, or when did you make your move into the US and kind of get into the area where I guess you are now? And or have you been in that same area fishing those rivers since you first got over here?
Oh, okay. I first came over here in the 1970s, and I was always fascinated by the perception that the western rivers out there in Montana were the in-all and be-all place to go fly fish for trout.
Right.
And I used to buy some products from some of the companies there in West Yellowstone, because you couldn't obtain, for example, genetic hackle in the UK. Nobody did that over there. Mm-hmm. And so I used to buy Henry Hoffman capes, okay? Yep. And I would get those from some of the resources there in West Yellowstone. But any event, I came over and I wanted to go fishing over there, which was kind of an eye-opener to me in that sense of the word, because as much as the English chalk streams are beautiful places to fish, they're totally different from the western river systems. Totally different. First and foremost, you have rainbow trout in those systems, and some places you've got cutthroats. That doesn't exist in English chalk streams. They're all browns. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily wild fish, because interestingly enough, historically, the English river keepers were the first guys to figure out how to essentially raise fish in hatcheries. And so what they would do, they would catch up the brown trout during this running time of when they run into the rivers to spawn. They would strip them, and then they would go through the same process as largely hatcheries do today. They essentially incubate the eggs and raise the fish on to a size that His Worship wanted stocked in the river, which is usually about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds, something like that. Of course, as we all know it today, raising trout in hatcheries is a massive commercial operation. However, I was totally fascinated by that. And it was a totally different style of fishing to what I would be used to in the UK. Essentially, there was more hatches. That's the first thing. And so dry fly fishing had more predominance there at that time. and nymph fishing techniques. You know, I can tell you another interesting thing about that. You know, by and large, nymph fishing, as we know it today, and you know, when I talk to fly fishermen today, I said, you know, you need to understand that what you know today, you know, not so many years ago didn't exist. You know, 80% of the fly pans you use today, probably 20 years ago, didn't exist, and stuff like that. That's largely also somewhat related to the techniques of fly fishing. Go back 20 years, the vast majority of the techniques that people tend to want to use today, like Euro nymph fishing or that kind of carry on, it didn't exist here. It was practiced over there to some extent, but it didn't exist here. And so your general approach to nymph fishing, as an example, on a river system in the UK, would be with an upstream presentation. I never knew what a darn indicator was until I come over here to the US. Never seen such a thing in my life. Right?
Yeah.
And I thought, you know, I can understand the logic and the worth of doing it, but I learned skills how to catch fish nymph fishing wise without the use of an indicator. What largely has changed that scenario was the competitive world of fly fishing, to which I was also, very much related to. You know, for 18 years, I fished competitive fly fishing events, and I loved the hell out of it, you know, because, I don't know, it's not something that you do for monetary reward, because there is none. You do it for your own personal self-satisfaction, I guess, but also the comradeship of all the other guys from the different countries and teams you fish against. You know, it's what we call a good craft. But I will tell you that almost certainly, and I'll argue that till the cows come home, that competitive fly fishing has been almost largely responsible for the development of a more fly fishing technique and skills. Right. No argument about it. You know, whether it's still water related or moving water related, it has. And I think that human nature, you know, that necessary urge to kind of want to do better than somebody else or develop new means, methods, and or techniques to do better than somebody else, obviously had a lot to do with why those techniques, as in many respects as we know them today, advanced as much as they did. Because historically, years ago when I started fly fishing, the standard method of fishing under still water or a lake would be with traditional wet flies. And in the boat, what we call traditional lock style fishing, which is where a boat broadside on is drifted downwind, and a team of flies, 3 or 4, would be cast in front of that drifting boat and retrieved back towards the boat. That's traditional lock style fishing. And it's actually a very skillful form of fly fishing. Unfortunately, there's not many places here in the U.S. you can practice that. There's some pretty damn decent lakes out in Montana. Hebgen Lake is a great lake for that, and it's Quake Lake. And I spent a lot of time out there doing it on those particular lakes. But other than that, there's not too many resources for you to do that. That said, how can I put this into context? Okay. Traditional wet fly fishing, in my book, is the arts and skills of fishing, by and large, classic traditional wet flies that almost, in most cases, are wing flies. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with many of those fly patterns, but if you take examples of flies like the butcher or the dunkeld, they're traditional classic wet flies, which have been around for...
The lead wing coachman, is that a traditional pattern, or is that more of a newer wet fly?
Yeah, that's a fly of American origin, albeit it is derived from the English version of the coachman and or the royal coachman. You just raised a valid point there, which I'll explain, is that bear this in mind that in most cases, fly fishing has its roots in the eastern parts of the United States. And that being so, the majority of species they fish for were brook trout, okay? Because in most cases, neither brown trout or rainbow trout were stocked into those rivers. That largely was something brought about by the U.S. Fish Commission, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, throughout the country. So the introduction of fly fishing into North America, so to speak, largely was related to what was already known over there in Europe in the first place. And so traditional wet flies very much had a significant place, as far as fishing. And there were certain flies that have more of an American origin because they were somewhat more related to the species they were fishing for, more like brook trout that tend to like more gaudy, flashy flies. Now, that said, I look at traditional wet flies in many, many different ways, and I kind of categorize them in three ways. You have what we call imitators. So if you take a fly like a winged red hare's ear or a winged March brown, typically they are flies that have some relationship to the species by virtue of the manner in which they're tied. I've always argued this point with people. Trout, in some respects, are kind of stupid, if you know what I mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
But they can become educated. And what I mean by that is they get conditioned by the fact that human beings consistently pursue to try to catch them. They're no different from any other wild creature. If they're not subject to consistent pressure, they're not so difficult to catch if you approach them in the right way. Let's just put it like that. So if you take flies like the March brown and the winged red hare's ear or the blue dun or the iron blue dun, they are representatives of a species, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And if you use those fans incidentally during the hatches of those insects, you almost certainly, if you present them in the right manner, catch fish if they're feeding on those naturals. Then we have flies that we define as deceivers. They kind of deceive a fish. Now, the truth of the matter is, I don't care what it is you throw out a fish, you're deceiving it, okay? You're deceiving it into it believing it's either something worthwhile, natural to eat, or it's just taking it and deciding whether it is or it ain't and spit it out if it don't like it. But you're actually deceiving fish. It doesn't matter what you fish. I don't care whether you fish a hopper, and if you're deceiving the fish at the end of the day. So, that said, there are certain flies I would define as deceivers. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with those either, but, a classic fly like would be a Wickham's Fancy. It's a gold-bodied fly with, a brown hackle, palmer down the body, and a grey mallard wing. Does it look like anything in nature we are looking at? No, of course it doesn't. But in some respects, there's something about the fly, the attractiveness of that fly, that appeals to trout because it's one of the most effective. Another fly like that would be, for example, a Peter Roth. In my opinion, trout take that because it resembles a small pin fry, because it's got a silver body, a little red dubbed thorax, black hackle, and a teal wing. You pull that fly through the water, it looks like a little pin fly. Then we have flies that I would define more so as attractors. So if you take, for example, a dun-curled, it's a gold-bodied fly with an orange hackle and a bronze mallard wing. Nothing in nature remotely resembles that. That said, it and a whole bunch of other flies, which I would define as attractors, will attract fish under certain prevailing conditions. And then it may work real good one day, but not the next. And one of the skills of fly fishing, as far as traditional wet fly fishing is concerned, is understanding the prevailing conditions at that time, which is based on a lot of different issues. It could be the time of the year, it could be the conditions related to the water temperature being one, relative angle of sun and light penetration into the water. Are you fishing your flies towards the east side or the west side? Things like that.
This is a great, the point you're making here is a great one. I actually had a question that came in from one of the listeners when I mentioned that we were going to have you on, and it was pretty straightforward, but he was just, one of his big questions was when to fish wet flies. And I know that's probably kind of a general question, but can you continue to speak to that a little bit? Maybe that person that's new to it, to help him understand, when he might use wets and the types of wet. Well, I guess you've described the different types of wets, but so it's not always dependent on the hatches, I guess. So you can fish them just as an attractor, even when there aren't necessarily that species hatching out.
That's correct. Absolutely right.
Okay.
The answer to that question, I would just say this: there is no one method of fly fishing. Doesn't matter whether it's dry fly, nymph, streamer, or whatever, is on any one day is guaranteed to be the best way to catch fish. I know that from years and years of experience. There are some days, I don't care what you do, The fish just don't cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
And almost certainly that has to do with factors that, whatever it be, water temperature, oxygen-related issues in the water, they don't want to eat. They want to feed. And you may have issues related to the water itself. Is it moderately flow water, or is it high water due to generations or runoff from this? All those parameters can have a relevance as far as what are the best methods of approach to fishing. So my answer to the question would be yes. There are times when wet fly techniques will outfish any other. There's no argument about it. They will, assuming at the time the fish are in a mood to respond to that style of fishing. On the other hand, there may be times where they're slow to respond to that, and you may be better off fishing the deep water nymphs at the bed of the river, because the water temperature is somewhat cold, and they don't want to move through the water column.
Right.
So far as what flies to use, that is, everybody asks me that question. And I can only give them these answers, that under certain prevailing conditions, I know that certain flies, 90% of the time, will work. They will catch you fish. However, whether they will or they won't is largely based on what you do with those flies.
What sort of action you put on the flies, or whether you're going upstream or downstream.
Yes, correct, absolutely. Because certain flies lend themselves more to what we call an upstream drift presentation, with maybe some small amount of animated movement, whereas other patterns lend themselves more to a cross-stream presentation, and you draw the flies back towards you. Unfortunately, I have to say the majority of fly fishers here that perceive wet fly fishing as the way to go tend to cast a cross-stream and strip flies back upstream, which is totally unnatural for a fly that comes whizzing upstream. And that results in a high percentage of mistakes and lost fish, largely because, well, I can tell you a number of reasons why. And the main one is because, A, it's an unnatural way for a fish to see a fly in the first place. But secondly, the anglers tight line them. And as soon as they feel that fish, they jerk it back. And instantly, you jerk the fly straight away from the fish's mouth. And you have to learn the skills of being able to fish, even on a downstream drift and or movement, a slack line. I know you may think, well, how the hell do you do that? But you do. Yeah. You do not keep a direct straight line. There's always some freedom of movement in that line that allows that fly to somewhat more animate. And when the fish takes that fly, it takes it, assuming it to be a natural food source. And it doesn't all of a sudden feel that solid resistance on a tight line. It'll turn with the fly. All you've got to do is hold the rod.
Yeah.
You don't really have to set the hook. You just got to hold the rod. Salmon fishermen will know exactly what I'm talking about. You don't jerk the fly out of a salmon's mouth.
Same thing with steelhead is the same thing when you're swinging flies for steelhead. Yeah, you don't want to jerk. You kind of let them take it, and then you go for it. This is awesome. Maybe you can give an example of, maybe you can talk about what you would consider, your home river, and maybe how you might take a beginner, get him, maybe the first day on the river, how you would get him into fish on the wet fly. Okay.
Well, that's something I do frequently because I have a lot of persons that want to learn the skills of wet fly fishing. The first question to answer is that my local river's the White River here in Arkansas. Okay? And incidentally, you did ask me how long I've been here, and it's about 20 years. Okay. And I'll briefly tell you the reason why I came to be here is because one of my closest friends in the world is Dave Whitlock, and I've known Dave for. Dave and I.
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to make a point. I have Dave. I was chatting with on the phone, and his wife, trying to set him up for another interview. And I think recently he had went into the hospital, but I believe he's getting better now. And I'm hopeful that I'll have him on the show as well. But no, that's amazing. Yeah, so you're connected with some of the biggest names in the world still.
Oh yeah. In fact, Dave will be here tomorrow at my house.
Oh.
He lives in Oklahoma now, and so we've fished and hunted an awful lot in our lives, and we've worked at fly fishing events all over the world together. A long time. Anyway, the reason why I came here is because Dave was always telling me, you've got to come fish the White River in Arkansas. He said, it'll blow your mind. And I said, really? And he says, yeah. Well, here's probably maybe 25, 30 years ago, I guess. And I did. And I had to stay with Dave and Emily, and we go fishing. And I was astounded about it. And the reason being is very unlike my home waters. Once again, relate to the fact they stock rainbow trout in these river systems, okay? Thousands of them, hundreds of thousands of them. They don't do that in my country. And so you quickly learn that, the skills of fishing for wild brown trout are totally different from fishing for rainbows, if you really understand what I'm trying to tell you about that. Unfortunately, hatchery rainbow trout are about stupid, I mean, they will wise up eventually, but basically they're stupid. They don't know any different. I know they become more difficult to catch. In fact, I'll argue that a big rainbow trout can be a damn sight harder to catch than a big brown trout. And that's my personal experience of fishing 4 years for them, but I know that. But anyway, that's how I came to be here in Arkansas.
Okay.
And so the next thing, people want to learn to fish wet flies. I don't know whether you've ever asked this question of anybody else, but I will tell you this. The downfall for the majority of fly fishermen in this country is they lack good basic casting skill. Okay? They can get away with mediocre casting lengths, whatever they're fishing a dry or nymph. But, wet fly fishing demands a lot of technical skill in casting because you're fishing generally long leaders, you're fishing multiple flies, 2, 3, or 4. I know in some states you're not allowed to do that. I know for example, in Montana, you're legally only allowed 2 flies. You can still actually fish a 3-fly rig, and I'll explain that more if you want me to do that, because the essence of how those flies are balanced between that leader system, we call that a cast, incidentally. The cast is the makeup of the flies. It's not related to the physical act. Balances those flies out and enables those flies to fish in different ways at the same time.
Yeah, that's the interesting point there is on. So when you have that cast of flies, maybe I have a bunch of questions there. One of them is, how do you keep from getting tangled? That's definitely one thing. And maybe there's specific, the knots used and things like that. And I know casting is obviously a big part of it. But yeah, I mean, maybe you can explain how you fish those differently. If you've got 4 different flies on your leader, how would you? Maybe you can describe that process of whether you're casting upstream or downstream, or however you typically will do it. And then how do you make them act differently, each fly?
Okay, may I just answer this question first? You had a query regarding how do you stop the flies tangling.
Yep.
Well, I'll tell you. There's 2 simple answers to that question. The one is that how you build the leader system in the first place and you balance the flies. And the second one, which is more important than anything else, is your casting technique, assuming you are using the right rod. And a rod that's typically good for wet fly fishing does not need to be a fast action rod. I like rods that are approximately 10 to 11 foot in length, which are what we call mid-flex action rods. In other words, they flex real good in the midsection. They've got a softer tip section to them, and that enables you to throw very slow, deliberate casting strokes, which also tends to keep the loop of the fly line, the upper and the lower legs, separated, and that lessens the chances of you tangling your flies. If you're one of those that's like hauling physical energy stuff, I'm guarantee you are going to get tangled. Okay. And you're going to spend more time untangling stuff and rebuilding it than you are fishing.
Yep.
That's all I can really say, that casting technique and skill has a lot to do with your ability to be able to fish those flies in the right and proper way in the first place. Okay, so you asked me about how I choose to fish certain flies in certain ways. Okay. There are essentially 3 fly lines that I would use for traditional wet fly fishing. One is a double taper fly line, okay? The second one would be a intermediate. What I mean by that is a line that sinks at approximately 1 or 2 inches per second. It's a continuous fly line. It's not a sink tip. And the other one I might use in extreme circumstances is a short section sink tip, maybe 4 to 6 foot with a 4 to 6 inch IPS, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a new line that Rio produced called a hover line, which has great uses at times. It's neither a dry line nor an intermediate. It will fish below the surface film. It was more a line developed for stillwater angling, where there's more. In fact, I'll tell you, there's more skill and technique in stillwater fishing than there is in moving water systems. But that's another matter. But that line works really, really well on moving water systems because you eliminate surface line movement. That's a big part of it. And you can also keep the flies on a controlled method or controlled retrieve at a certain level in the water.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important at times. So how do I build system? If I'm fishing more on an upstream mode, the reason I'm doing that is because by and large the fish are at that time feeding on emergent insects and or duns or whatever. They're more inclined to take stuff off the surface in a natural manner, natural food sources. And so I'm going to present flies in that manner. So I'm not going to use generally large flies. They're generally going to be not much bigger than size 14s, in large cases sometimes 16s and 18s. They may be combinations of wing wet flies, but I may also use a lot of spiders and soft tackles. Because I want those flies to be presented in a very delicate manner, like they're a natural food source, just naturally moving in the surface film. And if you use the right system and present it in the right way, you'll get as close as you possibly can to representing how a natural food source is moved in the meniscus, right, the surface, okay? And so that would be a dead drift mode.
Yeah.
To deal with that, well, let me just put that into perspective. If I told you to set up a system with 3 dry flies spaced approximately 25 to 30 inches apart and cast those upstream, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're kind of doing a similar thing to that when you're fishing wet flies, soft tackles, or spiders.
Yep.
The difference is you can't visually see them, okay, because they're not floating on surface. So you have to develop skills of focus. And that's also related to how you have the ability to control your fly line and see at the slightest amount of movement, the indication is fish has took the fly. It may just momentarily stop, or it'll do something. You may see a little boil in the surface film, or swell, or something.
So you're looking at your fly. You're trying to. You can see your wet flies when they're coming down, or are you looking at something else to detect the strike?
No. Correct. Rarely can you see the flies. There are certain circumstances you can if you're in an elevated position looking down, but generally when you're wade water fishing, you can. And so what you're doing is you're looking for anything that gives you a sign of detection. Fishes take those flies. And I would tell you from experience, it takes a lot of control and focus to be able to do that. And more to the point, line control, big time, line control. You must have no adverse drag. In other words, what I mean by that is that the influence of current moving downstream must not cause those flies to go downstream faster than the natural movement of the water.
Yeah.
Okay? All right. And I generally use very long leader systems, never much less than around 14 foot, maybe 16, 18 feet total. Because as you probably know, the finer diameter of nylon or fluorocarbon, whatever you choose to use, is less influenced by drag on the surface by water. It's the fly line that's going to kill you more than anything else.
So how much of your fly line typically will you have on the water if you're casting upstream and it's coming back down towards
next
you?
to nothing. Next to nothing.
Okay.
Just what we call an angular,
Gotcha.
an angular hang.
So almost
almost
like a European type nymph fishing where they've got really long leaders, and I guess but they go with some really thin diameter fly lines as well. You don't really do that though.
Yeah, I do.
Oh, you do. Okay.
I do. Yeah, even though I may fish a 4-weight rod, if I can get away with fishing a 2-weight line on it, I will.
Okay.
Because my objective is actually to present my flies. I mean, all the fly line is doing is just essentially helping you get them out there, if that's the way to explain it one to you. So the lighter line you use, yes, the better off you are because there's less influence of drag. Essentially what you're doing is you have an angular hang off the end of the rod tip to the surface of the water with a fly line. Now that's what I call short line fishing. What I mean by that is you're not forced to cast fly line to actually reach fish. There are times when you will have to do that, obviously, because you can't either wade there, or if you do, you'd spook the fish anyway. So you've got to cast a longer line. And I think on that DVD, Wet Fly Ways, you will see some of the demonstrations that I show, how you do that. The most important thing is you don't create adverse drag to the flies. You try to make sure those flies drift down in a manner which is close as you can get to how a fish would see a natural food source.
Gotcha.
And the next would be more up on a cross presentation. Oh, incidentally, there's one thing I should have added here, is that when you fish in that manner, you must never present those flies in a direct straight line. What I mean by that is you don't directly cast them upstream, because, you know, the flies are one behind the other and they're all coming down in the same line. You must angle the cast so the flies, depending obviously which side of the stream you're fishing, are coming down so each fly is separated from another. So if you're actually, say, building a system with the flies 30 inches apart, well, from the tail fly to the top dropper fly, if you're using 3 flies, there's a 60-inch difference between them. You follow what I'm saying?
That makes sense. So basically, you're not necessarily casting straight out. You're still casting up, but you're at an angle. So now you've got one fly that's at this hitting a fish that might be here, and then there might be another fish 16 inches out, and so you might be covering multiple fish as well as getting a different movement on the flies. And you're getting the different movement because of the different currents and where they're sitting, or are you doing anything different with your hands?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yes. Okay. You've got the surface movement, which, as we know, varies within maybe a foot or so, and so all of that is an influence on how those how those flies are naturally moved in the surface film. The trick of it is, and it's hard to explain to people, it's easy to show them, that you mustn't tight line it, but you have to have control of it. In other words, you have to have contact with the flies. What I mean by that is that when I say contact, if you create too much contact, you move them. In other words, you tight line to them. So there's a fine line between not having a tight line but not having control. In other words, you just can't have everything slack out there, because oftentimes the fish will take that fly. You'll never see it done it, because it gives you no visual detection. Okay? And so it takes, and I'll only go back to saying to you, like, well, you fish 2 or 3 dry flies, and you're essentially doing the same thing. The only difference is you can see the fish come up and take the dry fly, so you have a surface disturbance. In the case of fishing the traditional wet flies like that, soft tackles or spiders, doesn't really matter, you don't have that total visual disturbance like you would when you see a head come up and take the dry, but you will almost certainly get some surface disturbance when the fish takes that fly in the surface film.
Gotcha.
Okay. And then when we come across... Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, it's kind of like, occasionally they might take dry flies in that manner too, where they're just kind of almost sipping off the surface. But I guess that's typically, that's the wet fly, that's the emerging bug where you're seeing that sip. Is that typically what you find? Yeah.
But, yes, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, so if you're using like what we call North Country spiders, which is very fast flies with thread bodies and just small amount of hackle, those flies generally should not be tied on heavyweight hooks, and because the hook weight will actually sink the fly if you're not careful. They should sit just below the surface film for the period of time that you drift them, and so you're talking about 1 inch or 2 inches at the most. And almost certainly when a fish comes up and takes them, you should see some disturbance that they've done that. Gotcha. And then, if you then start working it more across and up, in other words, you're actually casting more across to the stream, but not directly across, say, from your position to the bank. You're kind of in the halfway margin of it. You're going to have a period of time where you're going to get dead drift modes, which is what I would call those, and then you get to a point where if you don't recover the flies, well, what happens? We get dragged, because the influence of water downstream will start pulling onto the fly line and pull the flies around in a semicircle that you don't want.
So are you fishing this out? Are you fishing this out as if you do cast kind of upstream and across? Do you, as it comes down towards you and then swings by you, do you fish it down on the swing down below you as well? Let it swing down?
No. Okay. No, I don't. What? No, I have three modes of presentation. One is the more directly upstream dead drift mode. The second one is more upstream and across, two across, and the third one is more across to down. So there's three different modes of presentation.
And when might you choose to fish? A couple questions here. The first one is, what type of water are you fishing when you're casting upstream? And then also, when do you choose to go upstream, whether or across or down?
Okay. Two things I take into consideration. One is there any natural surface activity that the fish at that time are interested to be active with? Maybe yes, maybe not. It really doesn't make much difference in that sense of the word, because I can tell you from years and years of experience and hundreds of thousands of fish that if they see those flies the right way, they'll come up and take them. And so, but that said, if we're fishing really skinny water, water that's maybe only 6 inches, a foot, 18 inches, that is absolutely the best mode of presentation, because generally when you're fishing water that shallow, it's moving pretty fast, okay? And therefore, when you fish them in what we call the typical North Country style, upstream, as that food source is coming towards the fish, they grab it pretty quick. They have no choice. And that's no different when you're fishing artificial flies. They grab it. I'll tell you an interesting thing about that. One time, I was with a guide friend who was a very knowledgeable fisherman, I will tell you. But he had very little experience on traditional style wet fly fishing. And he wanted to learn some of that from me. And no problem. A guy that's generally a good angler and got experience, they can kind of get onto that pretty quick. Well, we get out in his drift boat and we start going downstream, and we come to this real skinny, shallowy water shoal, and he's just like plowing for us. He said, why you just want to go through this? And ain't no fishing there, he said. I said, well, I don't agree with you about that. I said, you're telling me that because your experience based on the fact that nobody fishes there, and in first place, so nobody catches nothing out of it. Oh, well, they hang up on their nymph rigs all the time. I said, yeah, I understand that too. Pulled a boat to the shore. He pulled a boat to the bank, and I said, watch this. I started from the tail end of that shallow and started working up, one after the other. Fish come out there. It blew his mind. He couldn't believe that there were so many fish in that shallow water.
Nice.
And I said, why would you not?
Do you find decent sized fish in the shallow water as well, or a good diverse mix of sizes?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I've caught some really big brown trout out in water like that.
And is this unique to, wet flies? I mean, can you fish for, you talking rainbows and brooks? I mean, are there any trout species that maybe you wouldn't fish the wet fly, these techniques you're talking about?
Sorry, can you repeat that question to me?
Just as far as the different trout species, are there any, do you pretty much use the wet fly, these techniques on browns, rainbows, brooks, on all the trout?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I've caught in my lifetime a good number of brown trout between 8 and 15 pounds on wet fly rig.
Oh, wow.
As well as...
No, this is cool. I mean, I can tell you there's a ton of great information here, and there's no way we're going to be able to get to everything I can tell you tonight just because we'll run out of time. But I wanted to, before I forget, I want to make sure that people can follow up on it as far as videos and things like that, because I know you have some. You mentioned one, the Wet Fly Ways. Where would be the best place to direct somebody if they wanted to, kind of just get a video that shows you exactly everything you're talking about here? Yeah, well, they can come directly to me via my website address. Okay, so
and they can actually order it off my website.
Oh, great! So the DavyWottonFlyFishing.com, they can get everything there then.
Yes, sir. Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Perfect. I was going to. I still have some more questions relating to the techniques and flies and fly tying and things like that. But I had a couple questions I wanted to throw out to you that I've been thinking about, and I think will be kind of interesting. And one of them is, I was wondering if you had maybe. You've been, like you mentioned, since a very early age, you've been doing this and you've seen, kind of everything in the industry. What, is there a story, from your life or, fishing that really influenced to put you in the place where you are now? Does anything stick out in your life?
What made me do what I do?
Yeah, just to get to the point where not only that, but It could be that, or just the fact that you're a big name, and you've you've been around a long time.
Oh.
You're still guiding. I mean,
Oh.
is there like a turning point or some period in your life where you kind of went all in, or had those questions, or has it pretty much always been sounds like you've been fly fishing your whole life? So.
Yeah, I have. Well, obviously, when I was young, I never envisaged one moment that, I'd be where I am today and got, pretty good worldwide recognition for the things I've done. And I never thought that at the time when I was doing what I was doing. I just did what I thought was right. I started writing regular articles for fly fishing publications in the mid-'70s. Some of the readers or the listeners probably would have read a lot I wrote for American Angler and Fly Tire and stuff like that over the years as well.
Yep.
I've always had the belief that, if I can educate or help somebody else get better at doing what they love doing, I'm happy about that. Obviously, from my point of view, I've made a living from it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't make a fortune out of it. And unfortunately, I wasn't a golf professional. It's like my friend Dave Whitlock, he'd say to me, how come, we've done all these things in the fly fishing business and we're still we're still working? I said, I don't know. There's two ways to answer that. I said, let me ask you this, Dave. I said, just for example, somebody give you, $2 million tomorrow, would you quit doing what you're doing? I said, before you tell me, I know you'd tell me, no, you wouldn't, because you love doing what you're doing.
Yep.
And I would tell you the same thing. I do it because I love doing it.
Yeah.
There's an inner self-satisfaction from it, I guess. If you innovate a new fly pattern, it's not just a question of wrapping up some new materials in a vise and on a hook to me and say, oh, yeah, I developed a new fly,
Yeah.
I don't think that way, and I know Dave don't think that way either. There's a logical process as to why you do what you do, and it's purely based on how your level of fundamental understanding is on the behavior of the fish and what they're likely to do or respond to given the manner in which you present those flies. So, a lot of stuff I see that people post or whatever, flies, yeah. Would I use them? No. I mean, any fly, I don't care how diabolical it is, at some time or other will catch fish. The regularity that it does is another matter.
Right.
And I think that skilled fly fishermen, at least my opinion about some of the best fly fishermen I've ever known and fished with, they have a very different perception about what they will use to catch fish, because from years of experience, they know what they need to do to catch those fish. It's not a chuck and chance it thing. And if you speak to most of those very, very experienced fly fishermen, I guarantee you there's probably no more than maybe 10 or 15 flies they consistently use.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great point. That was actually a question I was going to run by you as far as, you mentioned a few different wet flies. Are there, a couple of flies that you pretty much are your go-tos? Or, I mean, I know it depends on the situation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What would you say are, like, if somebody, again, you had that person that's going out for their first time and they just had to fish a couple of flies, what would you tell them to throw on there?
Oh, yeah, I would. Let me just say this. It's based on my experience of fishing all the way around the world. I've fished in a lot of countries in my life, and many different kind of waterways. I've fished in Turkey and mountains there and stuff like that, and trout are trout. Obviously the indigenous species of Europe is the brown trout, albeit there's rainbow stuck in certain places. But the answer to the question is yes. I could give any person a list of about 10 flies, and I will guarantee you that any water in the world where trout live, one or more of those flies will catch you fish. I know they will. And if you wanted to narrow that down some, well, I could give that person a list of 10 flies. Mm-hmm. But if you take classic flies, for example, like a wing-wet hare's ear, for example, or a March Brown, or a Wickham's Fancy, or a Silver Invicta, or a fly what we call a cocklebundy, which is kind of like a beetle pattern, that's to explain it. Then you take a couple of soft hackles, like a partridge and orange, or partridge and hare's ear. I guarantee you that those flies will work in any water in the world where trout are.
Okay.
Now, you also have to consider this factor, and I always tell people this when I teach fly fishing. The wondrous thing about fly fishing is that if we develop the skills as a dry fly fisher, a nymph fisher, a streamer fisher, a wet fly fisher, soft tackles, we have the ability to choose at any one point of time what we want to do because we've got those developed skills. It's not so much that we want to go out there and catch a ton of fish. We all like to do that, and we've done it. But if, for example, you approach the stream today and say, I just want to catch my fish today fishing soft tackles, okay? Mm-hmm. It's your prerogative to do it. It's your choice to do that. And let me give a funny example of something like that. Mm-hmm. So we have two guys fishing. Bill Bloggs has just started fly fishing. He ain't got much idea about what he's doing. So he's fishing a big black woolly bugger, and he's turfing that thing out, and he's catching fish one after the other because that particular time it's just working. And then further downstream, we have a very highly skilled fly fisherman, years of experience, caught thousands of fish, but he's choosing to want to fish a dry fly. And he's fishing, whatever, little size 16 humpy or Adams. And he's only catching maybe one fish to the other one's 10. You know, who is the better angler? You follow what my point is? The guy that's only catching one fish is by far the more skilled angler, but he's using his preference of choice of how he wants to catch his fish. Yep. Even though he knows damn well, yeah, I could put a black woolly bugger on and do that, but am I learning anything? No. And that's another thing I try to instill with people. You know, if you cannot get out of your comfort zone, you're not going to develop any more skill. In other words, and I know people that are like that here on my river. They don't fish nothing but a olive woolly bugger. Right. Why? Because they're comfortable with that. Because their experience in the past has enabled them to catch fish doing that. Have they other developed skills? No, they haven't. Would they try to do that? Maybe, maybe not. It's their comfort zone. Yeah. So they're very limited in what they can do. And by definition of that factor, when situations change, they're screwed. They can't catch fish because they don't want to know. No. Oh, they want to catch, take an olive willow bugger. And so what I was just trying to make a point of the fact was that once you become an accomplished skilled fly fisherman, you have many options of choices about how you want to catch fish on any given day. And I think that, you know, where wet fly fishing is concerned, or the related issues of those styles of fishing, it is by far a technique that very few anglers here develop skills for. And I'm not quite sure the reasons why. Maybe they want to put the time into learning. I don't know. You know, I've asked people that question. Well, if no one can teach us how to do it, well, yeah, that might be right. Oh, we read this book, we read that book. Well, fine. You know, you can learn so much that way, but you really have to have somebody that can see what you're doing and tell you how to correct boats that you've got.
It's true, and I've, you know, the name of my my website is Wet Fly Swing, you know, and that's obviously not talking about traditional wet fly fishing, but you know, kind of goes back to steelhead fishing as well as trout, because my dad taught me.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, my dad taught me about wet fly. My idea of wet fly fishing was we used to fish. I'm not sure if you're familiar with or fish the tied down caddis much, but we fish a tied down caddis and soft tackles a lot. But we always fished them on the kind of the downstream swing like you would steelhead, and we did we did really well. But it was really interesting when I first heard about you and the techniques to see that it's not all about the downstream, the wet fly swing. It's, you've got different things going on. But that's my experience. And I probably would have never fished wet flies if it wasn't for him. And I always thought I was a little bit weird because I remember when I was a kid, I was like, God, we catch a lot of fish on wet flies and nobody else was doing it, right? They were all nymphs and dries. Yeah. And I was like, I guess I'm kind of weird, but it worked. So, no, I love the conversation here. I was going to check with you another question here before we get back into that. That initial person kind of maybe fishing for his first time, looking back on your life, kind of going back to like your 25-year-old self, is there anything that you would, you might tell yourself, that, maybe you do differently about where you're at, or kind of, do you have any words of advice you might tell your 25-year-old self?
Yeah, some of it I can't repeat on this show, though, to be honest about it. I will only tell you this, right, as far as it goes, that my passion of fishing cost me a lot, emotionally and financially, because, you know what I'm saying?
Yep. Well, you got to have the passion to stick with it.
Yeah, it's like, when you get back home late at night and the wife's indoors, say, what time to call this? Dinner been ready for 3 hours. So, yes, dear, but the fish was rising,
Yep.
They don't understand. You're not going to leave the river when the fish are rising, you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
So you kind of know before you get home, I'm in the shit over this, but it don't matter. I enjoyed myself. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So basically, maybe that there's not much you would have done, told yourself differently than, you pretty much had that bug and you had that passion. There's no denying it.
Yeah. The only thing I would tell you is that, I was very fortunate in many respects insofar as that when I've got to be known, shall we say, over there in the UK, I also got the respect from people that were established and had been well known long before me.
Mm-hmm.
And they got to talking to me. And I was also fortunate enough to get to know and fish for many years with a lot of the old guys, all dead and gone now, that had all those relevant skills from their forefathers from the 1800s.
And who were some of those? Can you name a couple of mentors that you had along the way?
Oh, yeah, I can. But they wouldn't be known over here. Probably.
No, and that's okay. I love getting a little bit of the history, kind of connecting people.
No, I can give you some. Probably one of the best of all was a really dear, great friend of mine by the name of Oscar Evans.
Okay.
And he was a man from North Wales. He was actually a policeman there in North Wales. And he had fished all his life on the natural lakes and rivers of Wales. And that guy knew how to damn well catch fish on those waters with what we are talking about here was traditional style of wet fly fishing. And he had, in my perception, obviously, when I was back then, years and years ago, was he had an uncanny instinct to know exactly where to present those flies and move them in such a manner you'd induce the fish to take. While we're on that subject, that is a big part of traditional wet fly fishing, is the inducement. You fish those flies in the right way, and you'll induce the fish to take them. If you do it in the wrong way, you'll spook them. And people say, well, how does that make a difference? I said, I'm telling you, it does. The manner in which you present those flies will either encourage your fish to have interest or it won't. Well, anyway, Oscar was a great guy, and in fact, I ended up tying all the flies that he ever used for fishing because he didn't tie flies real well, but he knew what he wanted in a fly, if you understand what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
But he couldn't do them himself. And so I ended up tying a lot of those old-style traditional Welsh patterns that very few people would know of in the first place because they were very isolated. And that's another interesting thing about the history of wet fly fishing. If you take the entirety of the UK, England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, geographically it's very different. They're different kind of waterways. It could be freestone systems here or spate rivers here. And the nature of the natural indigenous invertebrate species differed on those rivers. And the relationship of it was also related to the types of flies that were developed for those specific river systems. And more to the point, another interesting factor is, and bear this one in mind, years ago, you couldn't just go to a fly shop or mail order all these different fly tying materials. You had to use what resources existed within your locality. And so, for example, if you lived in an area where there was wildfowl, for example, then you would be able to get feathers from wildfowl, or duck feathers and this kind of stuff. If you lived in more woodland countryside areas, then you would get game bird feathers, partridge feathers, pheasant feathers, woodcock. And also, the gamekeepers back in them times, in the 1800s, and still today to some extent, they had to control vermin. Anything that wasn't a game bird, i.e. partridge or pheasant, they had to get rid of it. His lordship didn't want to see no birds of prey out there. They would kill them. It didn't matter what they were, owls, birds of prey, all sorts. They would sell all those feathers, And that's still largely a practice today. With the legal species, them gamekeepers, they collect up feathers and they sell them to companies like Vineyard, who is the largest supplier of fly tying material in the UK, and they process those feathers, and then the fly tyers could buy them. So they could buy snipe skins, they could buy woodcock skins. You follow what I'm saying?
Uh-huh.
And so a lot of the flies had some origin related to, A, the nature of the species found on those specific river systems, and also the ability of the fly tyers in the area that concoct flies from the natural materials that they could obtain at that period of time or in the locality where they were. Because, bear in mind, there was no such thing as being able to order the stuff through the mail. In fact, Messina, the first company really to sell materials for the fly tire, their business wasn't established, procuring materials for flies. Their business was there to procure feathers for either the millinery trade or decoration. And so, they get all these skins from birds of paradise and ibis birds and you name it. I mean, there would be women walking around with 2 jungle capes on the side of their hat.
Yeah.
No, I'm serious.
Oh,
yeah. And ostrich plumes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And what, to some extent, changed that was the classic Atlantic salmon flies, because they required the more exotic materials for those flies, not trout flies. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
Trout flies were basically what we call in my country like gaudy or dull-looking flies. So you take, for example, a March brown. Essentially, there's only 3 components to that fly. That's hare's ear for the body, partridge hackle for the tail, and the hackle.
Mm-hmm.
And you could use hen pheasant tail or hen pheasant wing for the wing. They're the components to that fly, all of which were easily procured in the areas where those birds were hunted. And then Messina's started that business, really being able to sell materials like that. Over here, you had herders, and they used to buy materials from those companies in the UK, Vineyard at the time. I know that because I've got some of those old catalogues. So a lot of the material that came from the UK, of UK species, came from that source. Whereas, of course, here in the United States, you had different resources. You have fur-bearing species that don't exist in the UK. And you also had the variables of deer hair, which is another interesting thing anyway. And so if you really, and I've always interested me the history of all that, how did this come about and and I kind of did a lot of research on that in my time over the years to try and understand that I could. Actually, Dave Hughes always keep telling me, you got to write a book,
Oh, yeah.
The stuff he's like, you
That's
only
right.
do know.
What's gonna happen to all your knowledge down the line? We're all gonna be gone here eventually. What do you? Is it just gonna? I guess that's what Dave's saying. It's just gonna disappear unless you put it down somewhere. I guess we've got stuff like these interviews here, but I can tell you as we're talking, I could talk to you for 6 hours, and I can tell you I wouldn't get everything. I wouldn't answer all my questions. That's for sure.
No, I know you wouldn't. Because it's really hard to condense that. You know what I'm saying? I can give you directive answers, but there's more to it than that. Really all I can say to you, Dave, is that fly fishing is a skill. Make no mistake about it, of all the different requirements, regardless of whether you dry fly, nymph fish, streamer fish, wet fly fish. But I will tell you, and this is my opinion, even though it is my preferred method to fish, and I can do it all, don't get me wrong, that wet fly fishing technique requires more overall skill levels than all the others put together. Because you can really only present, think about it, streamers. By what means can you present a streamer? Essentially, there's really only one way, isn't there? Yeah. You cast out, you strip it back, right? For example, dry flies. Well, what's the manner in which you present a dry fly? Well, generally upstream with a dead drift, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And you fish nymphs. Well, generally you fish nymphs in an upstream mode, dead drift or otherwise, but essentially that's it. Wet fly fishing, you can do all of that.
Yeah.
And more.
Yeah. So it seems like it's
See what I'm saying?
Yeah, so that's why it's a pretty effective method. And it also seems like, one of the problems with nymph fishing is you get snagged up a lot if you're not careful. So it seems like wet fly would be a pretty good technique for a beginner if you can get him into casting decently. So I'm kind of bringing us back to that person that's maybe on the the White River or wherever fishing for the first time, thinking the wet fly. So if he has his gear and he's coming up to the water, and I had a question from Ricky in the audience here, and he mentioned what he said was, I asked him what some of his struggles were, and he said reading water is still challenging. And he says, where do fish lie and why? And
Yeah.
how should I approach a hole? He said he did a
Yeah.
float. He did a float on his own one of the first times he was out there, and it was just like a puzzle to him. So can you speak to maybe briefly to those questions a little bit?
Oh, yeah. Well, he's asking a question that's got a whole bunch of different answers to it, obviously. Because how do you read water? Well, I'm only going to say this in a short sentence. You develop the skills over time.
Okay.
In other words, if you go to a piece of water, okay, I don't know whether he fishes a piece of water regularly and he becomes familiar with that particular river. If he does, then he should, over a period of time, become familiar with the likely holding zones of fish based on how the river moves. And so he may find, well, this little riffle water here, there's always find a fish there. If I go up here a little bit, I can usually find some fish there. But experienced anglers yet have a knowledge to know that under certain movements of water or certain conditions, that they're the most likely lies that you're going to find fish.
Mm-hmm.
And all I will tell you is that that's based on water temperature, which is a related issue to oxygen levels.
Mm-hmm.
And so, colder water, the fish tend to be in slower zones. And as the water warms up, then they tend to move in faster moving water zones.
Okay. So you're fishing, are you
species.
fishing wet flies in pool type water as well?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
But there may be times that they're reluctant to move, because they're cold water, their metabolism changes, and they don't need to chase around.
Gotcha.
And generally in colder water, they don't need intake of food either. A fish, the metabolism of a trout is that if the water temperature is not right or it's too low, they can't digest the food. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so they're reluctant to eat because they can't digest their food. And so as water temperature increases, then they generally get more active so far as feeding because they can digest their food. And, of course, as we know, if water temperature gets too high, well, pretty much it does the reverse. It shuts them down. Anything much above about 68 degrees, and they're usually pretty sluggish. Yeah. So to answer his question, if it's wet fly fishing that he's looking to do, I would tell him this. Look for good movement in the water, like the head of a pool where you've got, faster water running off the riffle. And then as you back down off of that, you'll generally find them more so to about midways in that pool. As you get further down the pool, when the pool gets deeper and slower, I'm not saying you won't find fish there, but they may be a little more difficult to catch.
Sure.
And so if you're fishing water that's got a little more movement to it, it depends obviously on your skill as the angler, but you're generally going to have more success there than you will further downstream.
Gotcha.
But all I will say to him is that become familiar with the river systems that you fish, and over time you'll learn, how to read water. That's the way to explain that one.
Yeah. That's a good answer for that for sure. Hey, Davey, we're kind of running out of time here, but I had one question, a couple here, but one I wanted to ask you that I've been thinking about from the beginning, and you were mentioning about you had that product that you sold to sold your business. Maybe you can explain.
To Wapsie Fly Company.
To Wapsie. Yeah, you sold it that back in the day. What did you learn from that whole process? Do you remember what that was like, and did that teach you?
Oh yeah. I learned an unbelievable amount because it took me 2 years to perfect that product line, or the original one, because it wasn't just as simple as people realize. I had to learn how to blend different materials together. That's the first thing. In fact, as far as the standard dubbing, the SLF standard dubbing, it wasn't one specific fiber. It was a combination of different fibers that I blended by percentages to get that, what I considered to be as close as damn possible to what real high quality silver was.
Gotcha.
Then I had to figure out all the dye processes to get all those different shades, which were 48 altogether. And don't forget, historically, a lot of material was sold and had a related name to the specific insect. So, like dark olive would be used for large dark olive, or medium olive for the medium olives. It flies, right? Mm-hmm. Or blue dun, or iron blue dun. You follow what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the original dyeware, as it's known, that Vineyard actually was the company that did that, add a relationship by definition of the color to the species for the fly that you were using to imitate those. Okay? Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I know we don't have time to talk about it now, but I'd love to discuss that matter with you at some other time.
Sure.
What is now perceived to be UV material.
Oh, right.
I have a very different view about that, but that's another matter.
Well, I definitely, the way it's going here, I mean, I think we'll definitely have you on for another episode because there's a bunch of questions I think people will still have after this. But no, I think it's really interesting, that background.
Yeah, I very much enjoy to do that. Now, I can talk more about the techniques of wet fly fishing. Obviously, we didn't get into the issues of, how you animate dropper flies and how you build your rig systems. And incidentally, you asked the question earlier on. I never answered it, which was, yes, you must use detached droppers. Mm-hmm. In other words, your dropper must be detached from the main leader system by a minimum of 4 inches.
Okay.
And in some cases more.
Yep.
And it's a very simple thing to do.
Yeah.
Most of the knots.
What's the knot called when you tie it? It's basically you're tying it perpendicular off of your main line, your main leader.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Years ago, when gut was used, you had to use very specific guts to join gut before the days of nylon.
Yep.
And I will tell you, and I'll tell anybody else, I know probably 10 different ways to tie droppers, but the most efficient way to do it is with a 3 or 4 turn surgeon's knot.
Yep.
And you must always remember to use the lower tag, not the upper. Mm-hmm. In other words, when you create that knot, you create 2 tags, okay? And the tag you use is not the one that's closest to your fly line. It is the one below it.
Okay.
Because it is stronger connection. If you tie the fly to the one above, and it's very simple for you to prove this to yourself, if you make that knot and hold that tag and pull it down, you see how it wrenches against the top of the knot. And if you do it below. And, of course, the only knot I use to tie flies on is the Davy knot. And that's a knot, but when I was a kid, the only way I knew how to tie a down hook on a piece of line.
Uh-huh.
And I've used that all my life, and I've hundreds of people have written about that knot, and it's very, very simple. And if listeners want to know how to do it, just go Google that, the Davy fly knot.
And is this the knot named after you?
Yes.
Oh, this is your knot. Cool. This is awesome. I'll provide a link in the show notes. This episode will be at wetflyswing.com/35, and I'll provide a link to that knot of the video there, and plenty of other links we talked about today. But I had one other question too. We didn't even get into fly tying, which I know you have videos on fly tying as well. But I wondered if you could leave us before we let you go, just with maybe a fly tying tip. And I know that's kind of a hard question, but do you have one just for general?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Do you have something?
Fly tying. A fly tying tip.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have? Maybe you can make that specifically towards tying wet flies. Do you, or maybe you can direct something.
Yeah, I have a DVD related to that. That teaches all the skills. It's called Wet Fly Tying.
Okay.
So it teaches you all the techniques of tying tails, bodies, hackles, and wings.
Yep.
The wet flies comprise of essentially 5 components. Some a little more, some a little less. But anyway, the one thing I would tell you, for most people, the most difficult thing in tying traditional classic wet flies is wings. No question about that at all.
That's right. Do you have a good wing tip for somebody that's struggling at that?
Yeah, absolutely I do. Perfect the body before you try to put a wing on it. Because if you don't perfect the body, by definition of how you produced it, more so the hackle, you do not create a set good enough for that wing to sit right.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't care how you prep the wing material, if you do not have the body of that fly in such a manner to allow that wing to sit and not twist or whatever, you ain't never going to do it. So tying wings on wet flies is probably, for most people, the biggest issue with doing that. They have problems. The other tip I would give anybody, as you would realize, I've tied hundreds of thousands of flies in my life, is thread control. No argument about that whatsoever.
How do you
understand?
How do you describe or get good thread control? Or what does that actually mean?
the understanding of the relative tensions on the thread during the process of producing the fly. You know, when to add tension to the thread, when not to add tension to the thread. You know, for example, if you're setting a wing, okay? Let me give you that example as for one. You're holding the wing, well, typically if you're right-handed with your bobbin, you're going to hold the wing with your left hand.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, when I set wings, I don't use my thumb and my index finger. I use my thumb and my second finger. And the reason I do that is because you can hold the wing square. If you right now just put your thumb and your index finger together, they don't sit square.
No.
Right? Your index finger will brush off your thumb. Mm-hmm. If you get your second finger and put it on top of your thumb, it comes down almost square, right? Like fair pliers. Okay. So you always hold the wing that way. And the thing about it is that once you've taken that turner thread over with typically a pinch and loop technique where you push it back, that first wrapper thread you make is absolutely the most important. Mm-hmm. Because if you screw that wing with that first wrapper thread, I don't care how many more you put on, it ain't going to correct the problem. Yeah. And so the first wrapper thread has to be very positive, and it has to be maximum tension when you crank that material down. If you don't have maximum tension, or you back that tension off after you've set that wing down, you're going to cause that wing to twist, or something will go wrong. You have to maintain absolute maximum tension to that thread with the first, second, and third winds. If you do that, your wing should stay there. If it's not right with the first turn, you're not going to get it right. Take it off and try again.
Gotcha. No, that's a good way. That is I'll try to, like I said, try to provide some links to. I'm not sure if you have any videos on YouTube of these techniques, but I'll try to dig some stuff up on.
Yeah, I do actually. If they type my name in, they'll find some stuff on there that related to that.
Good. Yeah.
Right?
I've watched some of your videos, your DVDs, and they are really, really great. I've definitely learned a lot myself watching them. So, yeah, Davey, we got to get out of here. But I wanted to, before we do, maybe you can let people know, maybe in the next 6 months, if you have anything, what we might expect from you. Or I'm not sure if you're going to be guiding more, or if you have anything new coming up that we can keep an eye out for.
Yeah, I've got a few shows that I have to attend. I've got some wet fly schools that are going to take place on the Little Missouri River, which is like the lower part of Arkansas. It's a good ways near Murfreesboro area. I have wet fly schools going on here at this time also. I'm doing programs at the Branson Fly Fishing Show, and it'll be at the Federation Fly Fishing Show here in October. Mm-hmm. And of course, over the years, I've been all the way around the country doing programs as well also. Yeah, people, I guess, let me tell you, if anybody wants to email me, and I'd be most welcome to reply to whatever their questions are. It doesn't matter, Obviously, I have time that I can do that and time I can't do that, but I don't mind to answer questions from people if they want to call me or email me or whatever about anything we've been talking about this evening. It's not a problem.
Great. I'll leave a link to your email in the show notes as well. And yeah, I guess maybe you can also let us know just one more time where they can find you. So email, I'll leave a link there, but your website again is the best place if they want to track down the videos or information at davywottonflyfishing.com.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay.
Or they can call me, either one. But all that information is on the website, Dave.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, definitely, like we said, we could talk another hour, and I hope to have you back on to follow up with some of these other questions that we didn't have. And I think there will probably be some questions coming, that come out of this show. But yeah, I just want to thank you for coming on and say thanks for all the information out there. It's definitely cool to get a little bit of the history on wet fly fishing, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you. So thanks, Davey, for coming on here.
You're welcome, and I look forward to the future.
All right, thanks. See ya.
Take care now.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes with all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/35. If you get a chance, it would be great if you can send a tweet on Twitter and use a lightning bolt emoji if you can find it. That would be awesome. I'd know you're still out here even at the end of the show. That would be cool. So that's all we have for the show today. Thanks again for stopping by to check out the show today. I'm looking forward to catching up with you soon, and maybe even seeing you online or on the river. Later.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.